Hello, everybody, and welcome to my virtual talk, Prehistoric Diets in the Southern Levant. And in the next small half hour or so, we're going to delve into this topic, and I hope that by the end of it, you've learned something and had a good time. And I'm sorry not to be here in person, but we have to make do with what we can in this pandemic. So let's have a think about diets. So if you look at our diet nowadays, it consists of a vegetable proportion and a meat proportion. And on the screen here, you can see a lovely example of some Middle Eastern food, and you can see it's a rich mix of not only colors, but also fragrances and tastes, and all in all things that we love to eat. And if we take a minute to think about what actually food is and what subsistence is, I hope you'll agree to me that we have different tastes, and these tastes do not only evolve within our lifetime, but they also evolve over generations. And so an example I really love to give my students, for example, is asking them what they really enjoy today, for example, avocado toast, and then ask the question if your grandparents have ever heard of this, or your great-grandparents. And that's just a small example of how some new foods can be introduced in the generations. Also, going back to that example, if we think about pig trotters, that's something that, at least in Europe, is something commonly eaten in the generation of our great-parents, great-grandparents. But then, on average, let's say teenagers nowadays usually turn up their noses to that. And if we think about prehistoric diet, we should be having similar concepts. So people have changing tastes. And if we look at that over generations, or more specifically in the context of archaeology over thousands of years, it's bound to change dramatically. Or at least that's what we think or would assume based on this tale. And so how can we look at diet in the past? Well, we can look at how they cultivated their crops. We can see at how they would herd their animals, what management practices they would have. And so in that regard, we're specifically also looking at pastoralism. So the concept of herding your sheep and your goat at a certain vicinity or location, usually quite close to your town, and then you move away during certain periods of time. And these are things that we know thanks to ethnographic research and also older historical records. But if we're going to look at prehistoric diet, and in the case of this talk, something that was about 5,000 years ago, how can we reconstruct that? And there's a really direct way of figuring out what's going on then. And that's by looking at animal bones and looking at usually burnt seed remains. And the disciplines that specifically will try and figure out what is going on with this are disciplines called zooarchaeology, so the study of ancient animal remains in the context of humans, and archaeobotany, the study of plant remains, again in context of humans. And so knowing this, today I'll try and spin a tale on how prehistoric diets evolved during the Bronze Age and the Iron Age, and to what extent it stayed similar. And a lot of what I'm presenting today is actually based on the work I did during my doctoral studies and some of my, philosophies following that period. And so just to give you a geographic idea of where we are at, the left picture shows a map of the region we commonly know as the Southern Levant. So this would encompass the present-day countries of Lebanon, Israel, Jordan, and the Palestinian areas. And then on the right, you have that, you have a more broader map. And here you can see highlighted the area of the Southern Levant. So we're really dealing with a very small area here, all things considered. But nonetheless, this area is quite varied. Within short distances, we can see a drastic change of landscape, environment, and also climatic conditions. So I've been mentioned a few times already, Bronze Age, Iron Age, but what does it all mean? And so let me just give you a brief historical and environmental overview of the time we're dealing with. So the early Bronze Age 1, that's where we can see the rise of urbanism. So we see larger settlements being created during this time. We can see the domestication of the donkey. We can see the possible introduction of things like the plow. And yeah, the most important thing is to realize in the southern Levant, they're not an independent entity. So the ancient Egyptian empire very much has their hand in this business, and they have colonies towards the south of the southern Levant. And of course, why do they have these colonies? To gain profit. Moving on to the early Bronze Age 2 and 3, we can see the further development of these small urban settlements, and we can see the first urban societies. And this is characterized by the development of large public architecture, but also more importantly, a settlement hierarchy. And what does that mean? Basically, it means the bigger your settlement is, the more fortifications you have, the more important you are. And a really nice example of this is the granary at a site called Tel Bet Yerach, of which you can see a picture, which is a good example of public architecture. Oh, my mistake. So then what's that little star? That's one of the main climatic events during this period. It's what's called the 4.2 kbp event, and it's a major climatic event. As you can see on the lower timeline there, we can see that we're moving from relatively humid condition to more arid conditions. And for a variety of reasons, not just climatic, we can then see a process of de-urbanization. So a return to regionalism, more family-based society. So we don't see that culture of urbanism. Then moving on to the Middle Bronze Age, things start getting a bit more humid, and we can see the rise of the city-state. Now, the city-state should be considered as the next step in urbanization. So these are large urban centers with a hinterland, they're in connection with each other. We see the return of these massive fortifications and also that hierarchy in the fortifications. And for example, the picture you see here is an example of the glacis at Ashkelon, which can reach at parts 46-meter thickness. So this really isn't anything to joke about. Then we have the late Bronze Age, which is generally known as the age of internationalism or bronzization. We see huge flourishing trade. So we can see this happening between the mega empires. We have ancient Egypt there. We have Hittites there. All of these brand names, you know. And of course, the southern Levant is kind of smushed between these mega empires and has to find a way in between there. It's not only a buffer zone, which kind of hinders these empires of fighting with each other, but it also tries to gain as much profit as it can from this by becoming very advanced tradesmen, etc. So then we have the Iron Age 1, which is prefaced by the second major climate condition here, which is the 3.2K event, which again heralds more arid conditions. And then the Iron Age 1 is quite characterized because it's the first time in its history where the southern Levant has some degree of independence, and with the mega empires surrounding it kind of getting out of the picture for various reasons. And one of the more known peoples during the Iron Age 1 is the Philistines, which are thought of to be as immigrants coming into the country and making their settlements mainly near the coast. And then we have the Iron Age 2, which is characterized by the Assyrian invasions and also the end of the independence. And so I mentioned I'll talk about some of the work I did during my doctoral work, and that features two sites, Tel El Burak up in the north there, which is mainly the material present Iron Age material, and Lachish, which is a site in the Shephelah region, which has material ranging from the Middle Bronze Age to the Iron Age. And so let's have a look at that diet. So what I did for my PhD, and we don't need to go into the nitty-gritty details here, but what I did was look through all these faunal and botanical remains, look at that pure data, put them through certain statistical processes called correspondence analysis. And with that, I could see if there were any correlations between certain types of diet and certain regions or time period. And so one of the results we got is that we indeed do see a chronological trend. So in the early Bronze Ages and Middle Bronze Ages, we tend to see higher proportions or numbers of pig and emmer wheats. Whereas if we look at the late Bronze Age and the Iron Ages, we see higher proportions of fruits such as grape, but also fig. We see higher numbers of free threshing wheat and higher numbers of dromedaries. And the graph here is just an example of what that kind of science behind these results can look like. And so once we have statements like these, we of course need to look at what does this mean and why do we see these patterns develop. So let's start by looking at these dromedaries. Again, here's a picture of what the science looks like behind these statements. And so this graph in particular is really easy to interpret. The bigger the symbol, the more numbers of this animal. And so in the case of the camelids, we can see, or we know from historical research, that camelids only appear in the southern Levant starting in the late Bronze Age, but then they really reach their highest numbers during the Iron Age, specifically Iron Age 2. And well, this is a pretty straightforward conclusion. Why do we see more camelids in the late Bronze Age and the Iron Age? Well, because that's when they were introduced to this region. So in this case, it really is a no-brainer. But what about pigs? Pigs are a very controversial and hot topic, especially in the region of the southern Levant, because we are in a region which has a long religious background as well. It's a very important region for Judaism, but also Islam, and to a certain extent also Christianity, of course, but that's less relevant here. And anyway, if you look at the distribution of pigs, so how many numbers of pigs do we see in these various time periods, you can see the picture isn't as straightforward as you'd think. We do see the general tendency of in earlier periods, so the early Bronze Age and the middle Bronze Age, the symbols are a bit bigger. And then generally speaking, in the late Bronze Age and the Iron Ages, the symbols are smaller. But there is that one big exception, and that's that massive rectangle or square that you can see in the middle there. Does this mean I'm lying? Well, no, this is an example of why it's not enough to just look blindly at statistics and the science behind these results. You also need to look at what do things mean and where do they come from. And so in the case of this square, that's material that comes from Ekron. Ekron is a Philistine site in the Iron Age one. And you might remember the Philistines are an immigrant people. They come to the southern Levant from elsewhere, and most probably they brought their own traditions with them. And perhaps one of those was higher pork consumption. Now, this is a debated hypothesis. Some people say this is only the case in the large urban centers, such as Ekron, because if you look at the villages of the Philistines in the southern Levant, there's not as high of a pork consumption there. What the actual right answer is to this, hopefully we'll find out with more work being done in the region. Also, we really need to think about pork consumption in general and whether we're asking the right questions. Should the question be, are people eating more pork, and why are they eating more pork? Or should the question be, why aren't they eating more pork? And I really like this example. This was found mid last year. And this is a tiny piglet which was found in Jerusalem in the kitchen of a quite high society / prestigious household. And it just shows that really, should we be are we asking the right questions, or is pork consumption just something that was part of life? And are we only projecting our present day views on the past? Something to think about. Now, I also gave the example of emmer wheats being more present in the early and Bronze Age, Middle Bronze Age, and free threshing wheats being more present in the late Bronze Age and the Iron Ages. And just as a reminder, that was that graph I showed you in the beginning, where you can see it, actually emmer wheats has quite a lot of black there, and black indicating the Iron Age too. So am I just continuously lying to you? No, I'm not. Otherwise I wouldn't be here and I wouldn't have gotten a degree. Well, that's how it should work, right? So no, I'm not lying to you. The question again, or the answer to this question again, lies in looking at the raw data and not just mindlessly looking at the numbers and putting them through statistical software, but really taking a moment to go through these reports, look at the context, and make an informed conclusion. And if we look at the raw data, we can see that this number is driven by one site in particular, and that is Ashkelon. And at Ashkelon, we see a very high proportion of emmer wheat, even though we're actually in a period where we would expect a more free threshing wheat. And obviously the question needs to be, well, why? Why is this site one of the few who keeps relying heavily on emmer wheat when everyone else kind of made that transition to free threshing wheat? And it's not just the southern Levant. We see this development in Mesopotamia way earlier. So there we can see the shift from emmer wheats to free threshing wheat already in the Middle Bronze Age. So why is Ashkelon keeping at emmer wheats? And the answer lies in the history of the southern Levant. And in this case, the answer is the ancient Egyptians. As I mentioned, the ancient Egyptians always had their hand in the honey pot. They always had some dealings with the southern Levant, some more friendly than others. And Ashkelon was an important trading city, especially with regards to Egypt. And so Egypt was really interested in obtaining things such as emmer wheats, but also grapes for making their own beer and wine and bread. And this is why we can see the story behind that. So here's some depictions from ancient Egypt, where you can also see a nice example of a winery. And we shouldn't be that surprised about the trade. As I already mentioned, the age of bronzization, internationalism in the late Bronze Age. And we don't only have, this is not just based on hollow theories, we also have hard science providing this. So if you look at stable isotope analyses, which is measuring the ratio of a certain chemical element in bones or seeds, we also find out that there were donkeys. There's actually a donkey example found in Tel El Safi, where the donkey originally was from the Nile Valley. So we do know that there's an exchange of goods here and also livestock here potentially. And so perhaps if you read into this topic, the idea of sheep and goat comes to mind, and that's something I've spoken about very little here. So what about the sheep and goat, that iconic species when we're talking about subsistence, especially in prehistoric diet in the Levant in general? Well, let's just delve into that real quick right now. So I'm going to do this by using examples of material I analyzed during my PhD. And first, let's look at the site of Lachish, and specifically, we're going to look at the Iron Age material here, the Iron Age 2 in specific. And you see a picture of the tell here on the top left, followed by a more close-up of the area, area P being for the palatial area, area S for the settlement area. And here we see something that zooarchaeologists call a sheep-goat distribution. So basically, this little bar graph just shows you how many individuals of sheep were found and how many of goat. And the different colors resemble the different analysts, including me, who worked on this. And you can see that there generally is a preference for sheep. Now, as zooarchaeologists, so animal bone specialists, we can take that a step further, and we can, by looking at epiphyseal fusion, so when the ends of bones grow together, and by looking at how teeth are worn and when they get erupted, we can get an idea of when these animals died. And in the case of Lachish during the Iron Age, we notice two major things. First of all, we notice that most of the sheep and goat that died, who became adults, consisted mostly of sheep. So if you look at all the sheep and goat that died, we notice that more sheep reached adulthood than goats, to put it in plain language. And if we look at that epiphyseal fusion, if we look at that tooth eruption and tooth wear, which is in these bar charts below, just look at the red ones, and you can see you don't need to know statistics. You don't need to be a faunal analyst. Just look at how the graphs are growing in size. And you can see that last column, the column of adult, the column of F to I, that is the one with the largest bar charts. That means most of the individuals make it to adulthood. So what does this mean? What does it mean that the Iron Age 2 inhabitants of Lachish mainly kept sheep into adulthood and, well, had more sheep than goat in adulthood? What does it mean? Why would they do this? Well, there's several things. So first of all, you need to know that sheep thrive well in humid environments. And we know that during the Iron Age 2 in this region, there was humid environments because of that stable isotope analysis done on certain plant remains, such as grape pips, but also flax seeds and some carbon stable isotope, which was done on barley. And all of this indicated that the environment during the Iron Age 2 in this region is more humid and as such more beneficial for keeping sheep. However, there's also pictographic evidence to put this in the picture. And we also need to look at historical evidence. And so the Iron Age 2, as I mentioned, is a time of Assyrian conquest, and Assyrians, they conquer the southern Levant, but they're not just doing this for fun or because they're particularly vicious. It's because they want to get something out of it. And in this case, they want to get tributes. And we know from, well, textual evidence that the Assyrians prefer to have wool as a tax. And so the concept of the people at Lachish breeding more adult sheep to potentially have wool as a tax for the Assyrians as such makes this a complete picture, which is also evidenced by, hard science to indicate more moist environments. And let me then just quickly give a second example to kind of show you how we can nicely incorporate all these different lines of evidence. So faunal, botanical, iconographic, historical. And I'm going to do this with the site of Tel el-Burak. So Tel el-Burak, you can see a picture on the top left again and a map below it. And the red area, that's area 3, which is characterized by domestic architecture, and then area 4, which is characterized by the presence of a large wine press. And by large, I mean large. This thing could hold up to 1,500 liters of wine, which is more than enough for the, I think, 4 houses we found there. So again, let's look at the sheep-goat distribution. This data doesn't include all the bones which were found in Burak. We're still busy with that, but you can see we have slightly more sheep in area 4, but let's not concentrate too hard on that. And instead, let's look at when they are killed. And if you look at when they're killed, we can see that that line is actually pretty straight. So if you look at young, subadult, adult, it kind of descends very slowly. And this is an indication of not really killing your livestock, so sheep and goat in this case, for a specific product. It means you're keeping the sheep and goats for a bit of everything. You're keeping them for some wool, you're keeping them for some milk, to make cheese or meat. So you want to have that large amount of flexibility. And now, well, the material I just showed from the site of Tel el-Burak also dates to the Iron Age 2. So now you might think, well, why? Why do the people at Lachish need to have more adult sheep for contributing to this wool tax? And somehow the people at Tel el-Burak don't, and they just have this small settlement in which they use the sheep and goat for a bit of everything. And the answer lies in a different relationship here. So the people at Tel el-Burak were Phoenicians. And let me just show you a nice reconstruction of the site. So here you can see the wine press with the settlement in the background, or the houses. And so yes, these were Phoenicians. And Tel el-Burak in specific is thought to be an agricultural domain related to some of the larger cities of either Sidon or Sarepta. And what are the Phoenicians most known for? Well, they're known as tradesmen. And so Tel el-Burak would have been used to produce wine. And just referring back quickly to that picture of the wine press in the ancient Egyptians, you can see that's a really nice parallel. But yes, the Phoenicians are known internationally, even in the ancient world, as very good tradesmen. They trade cedar, olive oil, purple, all the things. And the Assyrians know this. And as such, for the Assyrians, it was more beneficial to tax this trade profit than instead demanding a certain arbitrary tribute. In the end, it does not end well for the Phoenicians, and they do get aggressively torn apart by the Assyrians with lots of burnings, but that's not what this story is about. So in conclusion, I hope you now understand or agree that animal husbandry and crop cultivation is interlinked, and both of these aspects are equally important in past farming societies, just as they are nowadays. We can see that substance is determined by multiple factors. They're determined by politics, economy, the environment, and culture. And we can see that all of these changes or stabilities happen in a dynamic environment, which consists of regional and supra-regional relationships. And it's not only expressed by trade, but also by the exchange of ideas and concepts. And as such, once we take this approach for reconstructing prehistoric diet, we get a large scale and integrative view of how things might have happened and how food came from the fields onto the plate. And so with this, I thank you for your attention. I'm sorry I couldn't be there live. And in case you have any questions, feel free to contact me through email or through various other social media and online presences. And with that, I thank you for your attention. Have a nice day.